Good evening, I'm Pastor Dustin Abbott from Emmanuel Lighthouse United Pentecostal Church, and we are here to do our final lesson in our anger management series, lesson 12 of 12. And so I pray that this has helped you along the way. And tonight we are going to dive a little deeper into a subject that we touched on earlier, and that is how to confront an angry person. I would say that one of the most difficult things that we have to do when in dealing with anger is, it's not only when dealing with our own anger, which of course can be incredibly difficult, but when you're dealing with someone else's anger, the idea of actually following the advice we have been given in this series and lovingly confronting a person is a really challenging idea and proposition. And so tonight we're going to hopefully equip ourselves with some tools to help to make that happen. Our quote for the week comes from the book of Proverbs, Proverbs 15:1. This is from the NIV version, which says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." So we'll start with story time once again, and this comes from Dr. Gary Chapman, author of the book that we have referred to often throughout this series. And he recounts one of his situations when he encountered an angry person. He says, "Sitting in my office one April afternoon, counseling a young couple, I heard a loud rapping on my front door. 'Pardon me,' I said to the couple, as I stood and walked to the door. As I stepped outside, I saw a man who appeared to be in his early 50s. He wasted no time in stating his mission. 'I'll tell you right now, the church will pay for my muffler. These speed bumps are too high,' he said, pointing to the church's parking lot adjacent to my office. 'They pulled the muffler right off my car, and I wasn't going fast. They should have never installed those speed bumps. If they tore my muffler off, they'll tear someone else's muffler off too. The church is responsible, and they are going to pay for it.' He said all of this without taking a breath and in his loudest staccato voice. His face was red, his eyes were glaring, and his nostrils were flared. I knew I was in the presence of an angry man. I closed the door to my office. Up until this time, my hand was still on the knob and the door still ajar. Perhaps subconsciously, I was planning a way of escape in case he got violent. I said to him softly, 'Now tell me again exactly what happened to your car.' Again, his angry words began to flow. 'I was driving through the parking lot, and when I went over that speed bump, it pulled my muffler right off the car. I don't know why they put those speed bumps in. They are too high, and someone is going to pay for my muffler.' 'Now tell me exactly what direction you were traveling and which speed bump you hit,' I continued. His voice lowered a bit, and his pace slowed as he said, 'I was coming from the activities building around toward Peace Haven Road. It's the speed bump at the end of this building. Why did they put a speed bump there? It's too close to the street.' 'And did it pull the muffler completely off your car?' I asked. 'No, it's still hanging on at the back, but it's dragging on the street. I've got to find some wire to attach it so I can drive home. It's not right. The church should pay for my muffler.' Feeling that I had heard his story and understood the situation, I said to him, 'I can see why you would be upset. I would be upset if that had happened to me. I didn't realize the speed bumps were that high, but if it pulled your muffler off, it will likely pull someone else's muffler off, and we need to have it fixed. I can assure you that the church will pay for having your muffler repaired. That's the least we can do. If you will send me the bill, I will make sure that you get reimbursed. If I weren't counseling with a couple, I would go down and try to help you attach your muffler, but I think you will find one of our maintenance men on the first floor. Maybe he could help you if you find some wire. I really appreciate your sharing this with me, because if you hadn't taken the time to come up here, I would not have known there was a problem with the speed bump. And obviously, we need to have that fixed. I appreciate your taking the time and effort to come up and to share that with me.' Now more calmly, he said, 'Well, I just felt like you'd like to know it. Did you say you were counseling a couple?' 'Yes,' I said. 'Oh, I'm so sorry I interrupted you,' he said, 'and I'm sorry I beat on your door. I should not have been so upset.' 'I understand,' I said. 'It was a pretty loud rap,' I said, smiling. 'I know. I'm ashamed of myself. I shouldn't have gotten so out of control.' Not wanting to add to his guilt, I said, 'All of us sometimes get out of control. It's good when we appreciate it and are willing to admit it. I've been there. I know, but I genuinely appreciate your sharing the information with me about the speed bump, and we will have it corrected. Backing away from me and moving towards the door of my outer office, he said, "Thank you, and again, I'm sorry I disturbed you." As he opened the door and walked into the hallway, I said, "It's okay, thank you." I've never seen the man before or since, but I have often used this experience as an example of how to respond to an angry person. Maybe I use it because this is the one time when I feel I did it right. Incidentally, I never received the man's repair bill for the muffler. I can only assume he was too ashamed of his behavior to divulge his name and address. The speed bumps had been installed 2 weeks before. As far as I know, his was the only muffler that was ever attacked, though we did have some complaints that the speed bumps were too high. The next week, we had them shaved. So our story illustrates an encounter that we can probably all imagine happening, and it's but one illustration of many, of something that we will all encounter from time to time, and that is an angry person. Sometimes they will already be explosive and even out of control. Others will be trying to moderate themselves, but will still clearly be very angry. And it can be any number of people. It could be a coworker, a spouse, a child, or a stranger. And so we need to think in the moments when we're not in the situation and the situation is not emotionally charged. We need to give some conscious thought on how to best deal with that situation. And let me say, preface before we jump further into the lesson, that you need to pay particular attention if you are in an ongoing relationship with someone that struggles in this fashion. Obviously, you don't want them to either hurt you or to hurt themselves. And so it's going to be really crucial for you to develop some effective strategies for helping to deal with that person when they are angry. So let's look at some simple steps on how to help and to deal with confronting an angry person. Steps 1, 2, and 3 are listen, listen, and listen. It may seem simplistic and maybe a bit redundant here, but the best thing you can do for an angry person is to listen to their story, then ask them to repeat it. That's listen number 2. Highlighting different details, asking questions to clarify the situation, and listen at least 3 times before giving a response. So in the first listen, you're going to be able to determine more about their state of mind, how emotionally invested they are, maybe how reasonable they are in that moment. And you'll also start to get a sense of what they are angry about. But I say start to get a sense in that often when people are angry, the thing that they are focused on is not actually the true cause of their anger. And often if you only very briefly listen, you'll never really hear what's truly behind, what's truly motivating the anger. So in the second round of listening, you are demonstrating that you are taking them seriously and not just rejecting or condemning their anger. And that goes a long way towards deflating their anger. One of the most frustrating things that an angry person will encounter is they will feel like they are genuinely hurt and wounded, that they have been done wrong. Remember that anger is the response of at least a perceived injustice. So that person that you are encountering, they feel like they have a legitimate reason to be angry. And if you just shut them down without listening, that's only going to compound that anger. And so as you continue to actively listen, to ask questions, and begin to consider them and answer them, you are showing them, demonstrating that you're actually listening, that you care about what is upsetting them. But as you actually start to engage them in a non-confrontational way, what you're doing is also allowing some of the emotion to dissipate and allow them to actually calm down somewhat, which is going to be imperative because you can't really help an angry person that is exploding. Until there is some reason and not just raw emotion that is there, you're not going to make any progress. So you're doing yourself and that person a big favor by deflating the situation somewhat, taking some of the emotional charge out of the situation before you try to engage in any pushback maybe against what they have to say. So it takes multiple rounds of explanation and then listening for an angry person to voice all of their concerns. Consider this, and I think it's a pretty telling illustration, that whenever a person goes in, let's say to a counselor or a psychiatrist, someone like that, the biggest thing that the counselor or psychiatrist will do is to listen. And often a good part of the session is just the psychiatrist listening, maybe asking a few kind of leading or probing questions, but mostly listening at what's going on, because there's a lot of clues that will start to emerge as a person speaks that just aren't there initially. And so you can learn a trick from the professionals and realize that listening to them is going to help them to deflate, but also help you to be much more informed and rational in your response. If you respond to them before thoroughly hearing their story, which by the way is going to be it's going to be difficult, because our human nature, and particularly in our society today, is that we're not often very good listeners. We tend to interrupt and, be impatient to the moment when we can speak. And if you can think about this for a moment, if you've been in that situation where all you're thinking about is what you want to say as soon as you get a chance to speak, very often you're kind of turning off the listening part of your brain. And so they're speaking, and you may even be nodding your head, but you're not actually paying attention. And so you're missing out on some important clues because you're so fixated on your response. But if you respond to them before you thoroughly hear their story, it will likely compound rather than diffuse their anger. So again, remember, the person is angry because they feel like they have been wronged. And furthermore, they're speaking to you because of one of two reasons. Number one, they feel like you were involved. Or number two, that you have the power to help. And people will come to you for both of those things. In my role as a pastor, there are times when people are there because they're angry at me or they feel that I'm involved in some way. And more often, they're there because they feel like I have the power to intervene or to help them in some way. So it's always wise to consider the golden rule, as we call it from Jesus. And that is to put ourselves in that person's shoes and to consider how we would want to be treated if we were that angry person. And so to give them the kind of respect that we would like to receive if the situation were reversed. Listening will help to pave the path towards understanding, and that will bring us to our fourth step, and that is to seek to understand the angry person's plight. There is an emotional response known as empathy. Some people are very empathetic by nature, others are not very empathetic. But being empathetic is essentially the ability to understand and to feel the feelings of another. And particularly if you're not a naturally empathetic person, putting yourself in their shoes is a really important exercise to help you to get some perspective and to measure your own response to that angry person. So if you were to view the world through their eyes and ask yourself the question, would I be angry in the same kind of situation? So for example, going back to our opening story with the speed bumps, in that moment, if you had been driving into a parking lot and you feel like the problem was not your aggressive driving, but you had gone over a speed bump that was too high and it had, ripped your muffler loose on your vehicle, would you be upset by that situation? Very likely the answer is yes. And so if your response to that person, if Dr. Chapman's response to that person had been, to just kind of start to accuse them, say, well, you were probably speeding, or maybe your muffler was hanging too low. Very clearly, that would have just compounded the situation. It would have made the man angrier. And if you can put yourself in that person's shoes, you would realize that very likely your anger would also escalate if put into the same kind of situation. While it's true that his anger may have distorted, it may be true that he is at fault in some way, but trying to point that out while he is still consumed by anger and not thinking rationally is only going to make matters worse. Rather than putting out the fire, it'll just add fuel to the fire. So your goal at this stage is not to point out the flaws in a person's interpretation, but rather to attempt to understand why they feel the way that they do. And even in that process of trying to understand their anger, letting them know that you're taking them seriously, it does help them to start to process that anger. So step 4 is to seek to understand the angry person's plight. Number 5, you have sought that understanding. Number 5 is to express the understanding of their anger. So once you understand how they feel, it's important to let them know that you do get it, that you understand. And so if it happens to be true, you can tell the person that I understand. I would be angry if that had happened to me as well. And so in that moment, you're doing something very, very important. When a person comes to you face to face, it's a confrontation. So what you're doing by this understanding and stating an understanding of their plight is that rather than being on the opposing side of the argument, you're putting yourself on their side. You're saying, I get it, I empathize, I understand, I get where you're coming from. And so you're becoming an ally rather than an obstacle in their situation. So saying something like, I understand why you feel the way that you do, or I'd feel the same in your circumstance, or I would feel that way too if I thought someone had done that to me. This is not to lie at this stage. My recommendation is not to lie under any circumstance, since Scripture tells us not to do it. And so I'm not telling you to just pander to the person and tell them what they want to hear, but to show some genuine empathy in that moment. That soft answer that Proverbs says that helps to turn away or diffuse wrath. And so even if a person's anger is distorted at this point, you can certainly understand that if you felt the way that they felt in that moment, if you perceived the circumstance in the way that they perceive it in that moment, then very likely you would feel angry as well. Now at this stage, hopefully you have started to diffuse some of the confrontational nature of the situation. You've tried to become more of an ally rather than an adversary. And it's at this stage, step number 6, where we begin to share additional information. Now, I want to be very clear. This is not about setting the person straight, but rather helping to add information that may help them to understand that there are some pieces of the puzzle that they may be missing. So you have listened while they told you their story, and so you've paid attention to them, but this is the moment where you might want to add additional information that they may be aware of. And so you need to share your perceptions. If there are some facts you're aware of that they're unaware of, this is the time to share those. If you share them too soon, they simply won't be heard. And so your goal at this point is to enable healing rather than to deepen the animosity of the situation. And so you have to actually want to help them as opposed to just put them into their place. And at this stage, their anger may be completely misplaced. They may have completely misread a situation. They may be operating off of a completely flawed set of facts, quote unquote. But at that moment, it is to help them to understand for themselves some of the pieces that they have missed, rather than just telling them that they are wrong. And by the way, let me just give you as a practical aside. If I have listened patiently to a person early on and allowed them to tell their side of the story, if that person remains really aggressive and they keep interrupting me and not allowing me to speak, at that point I actually have some credibility if I ask them to say, you know what, I listened to you quietly and patiently at the beginning. I would appreciate the same courtesy at this point. If you constantly interrupted them and never gave them a chance to vocalize what they're trying to say, you really have no footing on which to request that at this stage. And so I think it's important, again, to show early courtesy in the process, and so that later maybe you can request the same kind of courtesy. Step number 7 is confession and restitution. Now this is a really, really important stage, particularly if as the person has spoken, you realize that their anger is definitive, and particularly if it's channeled towards you. If you realize at some point that you have genuinely wronged them, whether that was intentional or unintentional, it's important to recognize that at this stage. And here is a really, really key point if you actually want to be successful in diffusing a situation like this. If a person makes you aware of the fact that you have hurt them, but your defense is, well, I didn't mean to hurt you, and you begin to argue that point, trying to duck apologizing over the basis that their hurt of them was unintentional is like a child that is standing over a broken window and repeatedly yelling, "It was an accident! It was an accident!" That certainly helps to eliminate malice from the situation, but it doesn't change the reality that the window is still broken, the damage is still done. If we have hurt a person, whether it was intentional or unintentional, and I hope it was unintentional, it doesn't change the fact that they are still hurt. And so in that information stage, it doesn't hurt to let them know that it was unintentional, but it doesn't change the fact that they are hurt. And so at that stage, I think it is very important for us to swallow our pride and to make confession. You see, very often what people want, above all else, is the one thing that we very rarely give them, and that is to acknowledge our fault and take responsibility. You know, going back to the illustration of the child with the broken window, obviously you may be upset that the window is broken, but realistically you're not looking for the child to pay for the window, very likely. What you are looking for, however, is for them to acknowledge that damage has been done and to take responsibility. For them to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I was careless, or, you know, I didn't mean to throw the ball to where it hit the window. I didn't realize that would happen. But above all, to take some responsibility, recognizing I caused this, maybe not intentionally, not hurtfully, but I did cause this. But trying to defend your own actions when you have in fact been wrong, even if it was unintentional, is not only an effort in utility, but often it's just going to lead to an argument, and it will seldom lead to any kind of resolution of the situation. So here's the problem. Most of us find it very difficult to admit that we have said or done anything wrong. It's as if admitting any kind of wrong diminishes our self-esteem. And it's very difficult for many people to acknowledge wrongdoing. Unfortunately, what we tend to do instead is we tend to defend our actions even if we know them to be wrong. And in that process, we actually compound our own feelings of guilt. We end up compounding the other person's feeling of anger because we are unrealistically defending something that is obviously wrong. And the byproduct of that is that our self-esteem is damaged, and we have inflated rather than deflated a destructive type of situation. And in that process, there's going to be no healing and no restitution as long as that happens. Confession and restitution not only helps to our own emotional health, but it also leads to healing the breaches in relationships, and also leads to having strong and healthy relationships in general. When you're in a relationship with someone that you know will take ownership for their actions, even when they make a mistake, it helps you to have a deeper trust and openness within that relationship, knowing that there is latitude for healing to take place, for healthy, loving confrontation to take place. And so you need to determine your next step at this stage of either apologizing or, if necessary, making further restitution. Now, typically, if you will have followed these steps at this stage, it will diffuse the situation and it will allow the relationship to be restored. And you will also have the added benefit, typically, of gaining rather than losing a person's respect because you were reasonable, because you were Christian in your response. Someone who can handle this kind of situation correctly is going to stand out in a person's mind because so few deal with anger well. And it could be one of your greatest moments of testimony if you're dealing with a person and you deal with their angry explosion in a positive, constructive, godly fashion. So we've talked about some of the positive steps to take. Let's end by talking about a few responses to avoid at all costs to an angry person. The first of those is trying to cap a person's anger. And, this is something, for example, we talked about helping our children deal with anger a few weeks ago, and we talked as a part of that about not compounding their anger as parents. But parents are often guilty of this with their children, and so they will do something like, often while yelling, if you can't talk to me without yelling, then shut up and go to your room. We just cap the situation, we shut them down, and without ever giving them a chance to express themselves. Now, that may stem the flow of emotions for the moment. You may feel like you've been victorious in the immediate conflict, but essentially it's like shaking a bottle of pop. The pressure is just building inside. There's been no release for it. And eventually you will have three possible outcomes. Number one, a child that explodes in rage. Number two, a child that sinks into depression. Or number three, a child who exhibits passive-aggressive behavior because they have no healthy avenue of expressing their anger because you've just shut them down and not allowed them to speak. And so trying to cap another person's anger is pretty much the worst thing you can do. While it may create a temporary calm, and for some that are very conflict adverse, that may be all that you're thinking about. I don't want to have conflict, I just want to diffuse, I want to shut down the situation. But the problem is that you have applied a very temporary solution to what will become a long-term problem. Their attitude very likely is wrong in the moment. But the fact that they are sharing their anger is in fact a positive, and it's never going to be, their anger is never going to be processed properly if it is held inside. So you may need to deal with their body language, their manner of speaking later on. But at the moment, you need to look at the heart of the matter and discover why they are angry. Help them process their anger, and then you can, when they're more rational, help them to understand that their way of expressing their anger was inappropriate. But don't try to just cap their anger and shut them down. Number 2, as a wrong response, is to mirror the behavior of the angry person. For example, they yell, so you yell. They call you names, so you call them names. Now, you probably won't be shocked if I say at this point that this actually only escalates things. 2 people that are out of control have basically zero chance of resolving what is ever going on, because there is no one to take the lead in maturity, in actually bringing some kind of healing and resolution. This can be difficult to avoid because we do tend to mirror behaviors. It's something that's been often observed about human behavior, is that there is quite a lot of mirrored behaviors and responses that take place. And so you have to actually, again, for us, we have to be careful to engage our prefrontal cortex, our brain, our rationale, and actually consciously think about what we're doing rather than just allow that emotion to drag us to a place to where we are mirroring responses without ever actually putting thought into it. And so it is a really important tool to learn to inwardly pray before responding in these moments, to ask for strength and the wisdom to not allow the situation to slip out of control. James 1:19 and 20 says in the New Living Translation, "Understand this, my dear brothers and sisters, you must all be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. Human anger does not produce the righteousness God desires." So the angry person may be spoiling for a fight. They may think that's what they're looking for, but a fight is not going to resolve anything. What they need is for someone to listen and for someone to understand why they are angry. You may have figured this out, but if you want to put out a fire, the way to put out a fire is not by pouring gasoline on it. And when we mirror a person's behavior and we escalate right along with them, all we are doing is adding fuel to the fire. But a person who genuinely listens will actually remove a lot of the fuel for the fire, and it will begin to go out. The same principle here applies to our children. We may be bigger and more powerful than them, but if all we do is dominate them, it actually doesn't help. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them." Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare." Both of those from the New Living Translation. Dr. Gary Chapman says, along the same vein, whether a person is age 7 or 37, harsh words thrown in the face of an angry person will simply arouse more anger. So our goal must be to help the angry person discover a healthy response and a constructive solution. So again, in a quick recap, what are our steps? Number 1 is listen to a person. Hear them out. Begin to understand their story. Step number 2 is listen to the person. Having heard their story, ask them to repeat it. Ask them to add new details, new information, and that will help you to understand what has happened and help them to know that you're just not condemning and dismissing them. Number 3, listen to the person. Ask additional questions to clarify things further. And often it will take multiple rounds like this for an angry person to get out all of their concerns. Number 4, try to understand their plight. Put yourself in their shoes mentally and ask yourself, would you be angry if you were in the same situation? Number 5, if you have reached that place of understanding, express your understanding of the situation. Speak compassionately to them and affirm that you understand why they would be angry. Number 6, share any additional information that may shed light on the subject. And so help them to understand things that they may not know. And number 7, confess any wrongdoing and seek to make right any wrongs that you have committed. At this stage, that is the only path to true healing. I pray that this lesson has helped you once again this evening and will help you, if you're dealing with an angry person, to get better at your responses, more Christ-like, and so that you can not only help them, but help yourself in the process. God bless you. Have a blessed, wonderful evening.